In 2010, I reflected on my 20th anniversary as a priest by fancifully listing out all the Sunday miscues, all the administrative kerfuffles, all the miscommunications, all the memorable times of pastoral chaos. So I took that entire list of 20 years and wrote a story called Pentecost Sunday, where all these things happened in just 1 year, most of it just at one Mass on Pentecost Sunday. In the following story, none of this would have happened if all of the connections between head and body, good communications, collaborative structures, and engaged lay leadership, inspired by good pastoring, good service by priests and deacons, a sense of unity by the bishop of the diocese, and a vision for going forward. In other words, this will never happen to any of your parishes or in this diocese. Once upon a time, a long time ago, and nowhere near this diocese, the good people of the Church of St. Luke were praying for a new pastor. After several months of praying and still no pastor, some of the leadership of the parish contacted the diocese. In response, the diocese sent to the parish a box of laminated prayer cards titled, "Prayer for a New Pastor." As it approached 1 year without a pastor, even the rotation of retired substitute priests prayed from the diocesan prayer card with greater fervor. Finally, the announcement was made that the bishop had appointed a new pastor. Father Lawrence Robertson was 62 years old. This was his third pastorate. He hoped and prayed that his new assignment would go well enough so that he would not have to move again until retirement. After the age of 70, the retirement age in his diocese, he looked forward to a life of saying masses without all the pastor headaches of budgets, bulletins, buildings, boilers, and bylaws. Nonetheless, he would be happy to help out at weekends at any parish that needed him. He would be happily busy with all the baptisms, weddings, and funerals for his relatives and friends. But as for the duties of pastor, well, to be honest, he had begun to look forward to 70 ever since the day he turned 60. 1,000 families was not a small parish, but Father Robertson was surprised that his first Sunday evening Mass at St. Luke's, his new assignment, to see the pews packed and lines of people standing against the walls. After Mass, Father Robertson quickly found out that it had been rumored throughout the town, that it had been rumored among staff, that it had been rumored at the chancery, that Father Robertson was being sent to close the parish and sell it to a local community theater. Father Robertson already knew from the diocese that demographic changes had produced a decline in parish membership, but there was hope for new growth. St. Luke's was one of the oldest church buildings in the diocese. It badly needed restoration, but parish revenue barely met operating expenses. Father Robertson saw evidence of the aging building when he went down a narrow flight of stairs from the church to the social hall. There was a special coffee and donut Sunday to welcome the new pastor. The social hall was a cross between a school cafeteria and a cave. He felt a little intimidated by the crowd, but he was in joyous awe of the 2 long tables covered with baked bars, cookies, watermelons filled with fruit, and differently colored bubbling plastic portable drink containers. Not a bad start. During the week, Father Robertson met with the 7 full-time employees and 3 part-time employees. He got an earful. They had not received a raise in 3 years. The parish secretary had recently issued a new policy which required staff to sign out for post-it notes and paper clips to make sure that they were charged to the right budget. Staff had a lot of ideas and recommendations, but their strongest message in the prophetic boldness of lay ecclesial ministry was that the parish needed to be a better employer so that the church would be a better example and bring economic justice to the world. Father Robertson faced these and a myriad of issues with cautious optimism. The trustees and key parish leaders were all in agreement with him that the parish needed a planning process to identify the priorities of the parish and lay out a strategic plan. Father Robertson announced at all the weekend masses that he would be having an open meeting to hear from parishioners and start the planning process. On the night of the meeting, he was surprised by the large number of parishioners who attended. Of course, it wasn't until after the meeting that he found out that there was a new rumor from those who knew somebody who had heard from just about everybody that the whole plan was just a smokescreen to hide the process to close the parish and sell it to the local community theater. So on that first night of the long-range planning committee meeting, 28 parishioners sat in the social hall tables. Several left after they had been convinced that the parish was not being closed. The rest agreed to be a part of the long-range planning process. But the real work, when the real work began, when they all tried to find a day and a time when they could meet. People took out their MyPhones and their MyPads and their MyCalendars. Lots of heads shook no, and there was a litany of reasons, everything from hockey to band to bowling. Of course, this was Minnesota. You can put in your own activities. They eventually found a few dates that worked, and Father went back to the rectory feeling quite happy, did night prayer with gratitude to God for his priesthood, and slept well. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, he updated the personnel handbook, reviewed the sacramental and financial records, and was grateful for the ready and most helpful resources from the diocese. He continued to meet with each of the employees. A good pastor, after all, he reminded his meeting-drained brain, is dependent on a good staff. As the weeks and months went by, the long-range planning team had done amazingly good work. They followed a planning process provided by the diocese and identified specific action statements in every area of parish life. Oh, sure, there were meetings and more meetings, but Father Robertson could feel momentum building. He could see that relationship building between staff, lay leadership, and the parishioners of the parish. During the season of Lent, the diocese offered a retreat for all staff from all the parishes. The staff of St. Luke's came away very excited and eager to implement some of the ideas shared. Father Robertson, who was unable to attend because of a funeral, complimented the staff's renewed enthusiasm and said, "However, I can support you. My prayers are with you." But in the parish, some of the staff members reported that Father wanted a special liturgy to recognize all the gifts of the people. It should be on Pentecost Sunday because Father said that was theologically correct. Staff reported that Father also wanted special music, and he wanted volunteers to put on a big potluck dinner to thank the volunteers. It was a common practice for staff to speak in the name of the pastor. Among themselves, they called it color power, and it worked. People eagerly volunteered and took up the tasks of planning the big Pentecost Sunday Mass. It seemed like they had to do all the work for their own party, but nothing could be worse than being without a pastor. At the newly reorganized parish council meeting, a clueless Father Robertson began the meeting by reading the gospel for the upcoming Sunday. At the conclusion of the gospel, He asked the members of the council to each say what they heard in the gospel. Karl Kutzenberger, who always introduced himself as the husband of Betty, cleared his throat and said, "Is this some newfangled way to get ideas for your Sunday preaching?" "We got a lot of work to do, Father, for that big event your staff just dumped on us." Father Robertson was stunned as he listened to each of the council commissions report on the Pentecost event that he was just hearing about for the first time. The theme was Thanked in the Spirit. Cindy Kelly, coordinator of the Extraordinary Eucharistic Ministers to the Homebound and co-chair of the Pastoral Care Commission, announced that Thanked in the Spirit would be broadcast live to both of the nursing homes. Byron Smythe, the organist at Sunday's 8 o'clock a.m. Mass and chair of the Liturgy and Sacraments Commission, reported that the commission had already approved his request for the opening hymn, "Come Holy Ghost, Creator Blessed." He would pick the rest of the music. Ursula Schaffhausen was president of the Altar and Rosary Society and co-chair of the Pastoral Care Commission. Mrs. Schaffhausen reported that her commission had decided to invite the bishop, but they had not heard back from the chancellor yet. Ole Torgerson, how do we all know just from the name that he's a convert? Ole Torgerson was chair of the Finance and Outreach Commission. He became a Catholic just before his wedding some 40 years ago, but he still felt tied to his Norwegian Lutheran roots. "I'm a convert, you know," he said to the council by way of his typical introduction. "But Lutherans know how to handle money too." Yes, there was laughter. Mr. Torgerson was head of the ushers and popular with the parishioners. As with so many Christians who come into the Catholic Church as adults, Ole was, for all practical purposes, more Catholic than those who were simply born into the faith. Then, with his serious business-faced look, he said, "My report from the Stewardship Commission is simple. The estate of Patrick O'Reilly, God rest his soul, just gave us $5,000. That's more than enough for a party." Beatrice Garcia was the chair of the Catechesis and Faith Formation Commission. Beatrice also played the guitar and cantored at the 10 o'clock a.m. Sunday Mass. On Sunday afternoon, Beatrice helped out with the music at the Spanish Mass at St. Rose of Lima. She reported to the council, "You know that we have a growing number of Latinas and Latinos living in our neighborhood, but they have to go across town to St. Rose of Lima because we do not have a Mass in Spanish. It is such a joyful Mass over there. So I asked the mariachi band to play for our Thanked in the Spirit, and they were very happy to do so." Byron Smythe, the organist by day and liturgy chair by night, disliked the 10 a.m. group and often called it the Hootenanny Mass. Beatrice Garcia often referred to the 8 o'clock Mass as the Opera Mass. Smythe tried to be nice as he told Garcia, "I already have used some of the O'Reilly fund to pay for a quartet, 2 trumpets, and 2 French horns. I already have every song picked. I can't fit in a mariachi band unless they know Come Holy Ghost." Torgerson asked, "How much is all this music going to cost? We only have $5,000. "Let's not forget the children," said Sister Mary Mark, Director of Religious Education and liaison from the staff to the Catechesis and Faith Formation Commission. "At our parish centennial celebration 2 years ago," Sister explained, "children carried in the opening procession wooden poles topped with bells and beautiful ribbon streamers. The bishop even thanked them in his homily. Therefore, our commission has decided that we will add the same festivity to our Pentecost procession. People love it when the children are involved." Betty Kutzenberger, whose husband was Carl, was the leader of the funeral luncheon workers. She had heard about the meeting from her sister-in-law, Ursula Schaffhausen. When asked by a council member why she was at the meeting because she wasn't a member of the council, Betty replied, "I don't need need to have any title. If you want to use the social hall kitchen, then you'll need me. I have the keys to all the cupboards, drawers, and storage rooms for all the funeral luncheon supplies. Even Father doesn't have those keys. Mrs. Kutzenberger gave her own report that she had already put in the bulletin the instructions for a parish potluck. Last names that began A through F should bring salads. G through J, hot dishes. You know the routine, she said to the others. Peter Daly was the parish youth minister. He had just returned from a youth ski trip, and Sister Mary Mark, his supervisor, required that he attend the meeting that evening so that he could learn how to relate to adults. Peter reported that he was able to recruit some of the high school-age peer ministers to set up all the tables and chairs in the social hall, serve the food, and clean up afterwards. Oh, but Betty Kutzenberger interrupted him and hollered out, "Absolutely not! Don't forget, young man, that your spaghetti dinner fundraiser left the social hall kitchen a complete mess. I'm still missing a lot of silverware plates and a whole case of paper towels. I don't know what you people do with those things." Peter lowered his head and a small glow appeared on his face. He had returned to texting his my friends with his my phone. Ursula Schaffhausen whispered, "Betty, we can decorate the tables with the funeral luncheon bases. We still have those paper placemats from the Quincy Funeral Home, don't we? It has the Lord's Prayer printed right in the center of praying hands. I think those praying hands were modeled after the hands of Pope Pius XI. Torgeson suggested that Betty use that free will offering baskets from Coffee and Donut Sundays to help with the cost of faith in the Spirit. He added, some people put $20 bills into that basket. Mr. Smythe turned to the group and announced that he had a choir rehearsal to attend. As he left, he told the council, "The free will offering can pay for the big new banner I ordered. It will have a dove coming down upon a group of people, and it will read, 'Thanked in the Spirit.'" After all the reports were finished, Father looked around the room and he did not know what to say. He had no clue any of this was being planned. But he thanked everyone for their excellent work on Thanked in the Spirit, led them in the Lord's Prayer, gave them a final blessing, went home, almost fell asleep, remembered his night prayer, then fell asleep and did not sleep well. The weeks of Lent and Easter flew by, and staff was singularly focused on Thanked in the Spirit. On Saturday afternoon of Pentecost Sunday, it was pouring down rain. It was also the day of the mayor's daughter's wedding. Since the uncle of the groom was the priest and had agreed to do the wedding, for some crazy reason that meant it wasn't on the parish calendar. The wedding was a long one, over an hour and a half. The wedding coordinator was only paid for 1 hour. So she had gone home before the wedding was over. At the end of the wedding, the bride and the groom went downstairs into the social hall as required by parish policy for a receiving line in case of inclement weather. And as per policy, the photographer had already set up his 2 flash umbrellas at the bottom of the steps to the altar because pictures had to be after the wedding, and he paced nervously, waiting for the receiving line to finish. But those narrow steps to the social hall were stuffed with a line of people from the wedding that continued well into the middle of the church. Some waited for a small elevator that had this handwritten sign that said 4 people only. Meanwhile, parishioners with their potluck contributions had arrived early to drop off the food in the social hall, as was instructed in the bulletin. With the stairway clogged, they waited in line for the elevator. They did not know that downstairs in the social hall, a dozen wedding guests had crammed into the elevator, and after the doors had shut, it quit working. Father Robertson entered the sacristy from an outside door. There was a scheduled rehearsal for lectors and servers at 4 p.m. Confessions were at 4:15 until 4:45, and Mass was at 5. He made a little note to himself to talk to staff about encouraging the people themselves to come up with ideas for parish events, rather than listening to the diocese and then recruiting parishioners to put on staff events. He went into the sanctuary, genuflected in front of the tabernacle, and as his eyes lifted to once again admire the beauty of the high altar, he saw that it had been covered by a large plastic banner. The red dove above a group of blue people actually looked like this big blotch of smeared ink. It looked like a dive-bombing crow. And the banner, because of the smudges, read, "Tanked in the Spirit." He groaned, turned around, and saw that the church was half filled with wedding guests for a wedding he didn't know was happening. At the back of the church, red-shirted children had pushed their way in from the blustery outside weather and valiantly held high their decorated wooden poles with the streaming ribbons and the bells. They shook them and twirled them. The bells jingled and the ribbons flew. Parents with cameras pushed their way through the line of wedding guests and led the children noisily down the main aisle. Meanwhile, down in the social hall, Betty had decided to use her own funeral luncheon workers and told the youth to go home. Then she shooed the wedding guests away from the decorated tables. No one knew more about hospitality than Betty Kutzenberger. Other people were shouting that the elevator was broken, that there were people trapped inside. Someone sent one of the wedding ushers to get the priest. Father Robertson was still standing by the altar trying to work with the lectors and servers. The parents of the children with the bell poles wanted a group picture before Mass and were negotiating a price with the wedding photographer. Mr. Smythe approached the pastor and was upset that the mariachi band had not arrived for practice. Ursula Schaffhausen, remember her? She was president of the Altar and Rosary Society. She interrupted Mr. Smythe, which few did, but she did, and told the pastor, I organized a parish rosary at 4:30. We didn't have time to let you know. Father was visibly startled as a tangle of family members from the wedding party came into the sacristy for pictures. They talked loudly as they walked in between the smiling bell pole carriers. A parent of one of the pole carriers grabbed the pastor's elbow. Our family has plans this evening, and we need to know what time will the opening procession end so we can leave. An elderly man tapped the pastor on the shoulder and pointed at his watch. If you want to end confessions at 4:45 so that you can get ready for Mass, you better start now. It's a longer line than usual, Father. The cadence of the rosary drifted into the church as two tall silver umbrellas flashed the bright lights of professional photography. What will happen to that poor wedding party when they look at those pictures of that smiling bride and groom with 3 children with bell poles? Oh, a wedding usher came up to Father Robertson and announced too loudly that people were trapped in the elevator. The sacristan angrily approached Father and exclaimed that the sacristy was too crowded for anyone to breathe. A woman in a red blouse carrying 2 boxes of red vigilites and dragging a garbage bag filled with red balloons asked the pastor where she was supposed to assemble the ministry leaders for the procession and how she just got the call for the procession last night. Suddenly one of the bell pole carriers had gotten carried away with the flying ribbons, hit one of the photographer's umbrella stands. The stand fell over with a crash and an explosion of glass fragments. Father Robertson looked up from the shattered glass and yelling photographer and saw 2 EMTs pushing a stretcher down the aisle. One of the EMTs went into the sanctuary and told Father Robertson that somebody named Mrs. O'Reilly, widow of Patrick O'Reilly, had a bad knee, and because she had been kneeling for so long in the confessional, waiting for the priest, her knee had locked up. The EMT said quickly, now I'm just the messenger, but apparently Mrs. O'Reilly got tired of waiting for a priest and called 911 from her cell phone. She also wanted you to know, Father, that she regrets deeply that her dearly departed husband, Patrick, had left in his will $500 for the parish. The EMTs went over to the confessional and helped Mrs. O'Reilly onto the stretcher. As they moved down the main aisle, there was a fanfare of 2 trumpets and a French horn. A quartet practiced with vigor the hymn, Come Holy Ghost, Creator Blessed. Thinking it was their cue, the children shook and waved the poles with bells and ribbons, and the parents took flash pictures. The wedding party abandoned the steps and fled to the exits, lest Mass start and they'd be caught in church. Father Robertson felt a tap on his shoulder and turned around ready to say no to anyone else. It was the bishop. Sorry I'm late, the bishop said. Apparently I was given the wrong parish name in the wrong town. Well, Ursula Schaffhausen, self-appointed chair and only member of the bishop's welcoming committee, had been actually attending the Church of the Most Holy Trinity in another town, and she accidentally gave the bishop's office the name of her parish. So when the bishop arrived at the Church of the Most Holy Trinity, he thought he was early for the special Pentecost Mass. But people were pouring out of their don't tell the bishop 3:30 p.m. Saturday evening Mass. Some of the people turned around and pretended to be walking back in. But others were relieved to hear that the bishop was just at the wrong parish, and the real parish with the Pentecost Mass was over there at St. Luke's in another town. The people of Holy Trinity were relieved that their staff just made them wear red on Pentecost Sunday. But others heard a rumor that the bishop had said that the 3:30 p.m. Saturday evening Mass at Holy Trinity didn't count for Sunday. So a procession of faithful cars headed for St. Luke's. Now the bishop was at the right parish, in the right town. It was 5 minutes before the start of Mass. Father Robertson kindly stopped the rosary group so that he could explain to the people lined up for confession that they would have to come back next weekend because the bishop had arrived. And oh yes, Mrs. O'Reilly will be just fine. As a whole new crowd from Holy Trinity tried to get into the doors, the noise had reached a decibel level most certain to cause hearing damage. Then the mariachi band arrived. As instructed by somebody who represented something, they pushed their way through the crowd and headed up the steps to the choir loft. Mr. Smythe shouted from above that they could not come up into the loft because it was already at maximum capacity. He was certain that in this case, civil law trumped canon law. Like a repeated responsorial, he kept yelling, "City code, go back! City code, go back!" It was hardly harmony when above his own voice a soprano shrieked, "Does anyone here speak Spanish?" Back in the sacristy, Father Robertson had cleared out the crowd and, innocently aware of the impassable front entrance, had sent everyone from the sacristy out the door to go round the church and come in the main doors, which was impossible. The bishop vested quickly, took a chain-connected outside stole and stuffed it in on the inside of his chasuble. Father Robertson tried to fix that Quasimodo hump. But he gave up and began rummaging through the drawers, looking for another red stole, and of course there was none. He grabbed the first white stole he could find. Only after tying up his cincture did he notice the leaves and flowers embroidered on the stole with the word peace on one side and joy on the other, and he felt neither. He didn't have time to care as an out-of-breath lector came into the sacristy and announced that no one in the processional could get through the front doors because of all these people from Holy Trinity. Father instructed that everyone should come back through the sacristy and line up in the main aisle in front of the altar. He dared his first peek out the sacristy door and looked into the main body of the church. The chaos in the nave looked like a mutiny of angry sailors. As the sacristy filled again with a procession of liturgical ministers, Father saw that the center aisle was filled with the colorfully dressed members of the mariachi band. The bishop reached around Father Robertson and pulled several times on a golden cord, and these old bells rang out. Out in the pews, even those who had never known why they were bells above the sacristy door immediately became quiet. Before Mr. Smythe could align his feet on the pedals of the pipe organ, the queen of instruments, the mariachi band processed down the aisle with trumpets and guitars, demonstrating that they indeed did know Come Holy Ghost, Creator of us. And as the people sung in full voice, so too did the specially mic'd choir, even though Mr. Smythe had gone ahead with his specially commissioned self-composed medley of Bach, Haydn, Mendelssohn as a prelude to the hymn. And even though Mr. Smythe had pulled out all the stops on the organ, the mariachi band had lined up in the front of the sanctuary steps, and their horns out-trumpeted the pipes. The bishop gently pushed Father Robertson out of the sacristy and into the sanctuary. Father Robertson led the bishop to the front of the tabernacle where they genuflected. Father Robertson did not look up at the sun. Turned to the altar where they reverenced it and walked over to their chairs. As the opening hymn went into its third but hardly final verse, the bishop turned to Father Robertson and gave a quick glance at his stole. The bishop said to the good father, "You have your work cut out for you here in this parish. Call me if you need anything." Father Robertson nodded, but he heard the bishop's voice not only in his ear, but coming out through the speakers of the church. Of course the bishop's mic was on. Before Father Robertson could mention to him to turn off his mic, the bishop leaned over to him and said, "You got the call, right? I left you a message this afternoon on your answering machine. You're preaching this Mass." Father Robertson hadn't received the message. But for the good of his people, many who heard every word, he nodded his head anyway. The mariachi band finished with a flourish, and the people burst into applause, while Mr. Smythe enforced yet another verse from his now disciplined choir. The congregation had already put their hymnals back because a pause meant the music was over. So they just turned around and stared at the choir loft. One of the ushers made hand gestures. Stop the music. One of the choir members saw and looked at Mr. Smythe and gave the same hand gesture. Then they pointed at their watches, the whole choir did, but Mr. Smythe was not going to stop until the last page of his music was turned. When the choir ended its grand finish, Mr. Smythe continued with an organ postlude that he had written. As he let the last note echo through the church, the bishop boomed out, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen." Mr. Smythe fumed that the bishop had not allowed the moment of silence necessary for the people to applaud. It was at that time that Father Robertson felt a peace coming over him. All in all, the good father, the soon-to-be good pastor, knew that he was given the sacrament of holy orders to bring order to the chaos of parish life. He knew that the Holy Spirit would give him every gift he ever needed, including a homily for this Mass. Yes, he had his work cut out for him, but at least he was a vicar general. And besides, tomorrow was Monday, a pastor's day off. The end.
lots of creative food for thought there. So just take a few moments. We have the opportunity for some questions for Father with regard to some of the thoughts and ideas that might have been popping into your head as he recounted the life of the parish there in Father Robertson's first Pentecost Sunday.
What was the question? That was St. Michael's presentation to the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. John Newman, each of the three parishes. The elevator and the mayor's wedding was at St. Michael's. The mariachi band was at St. John Newman coming in. I didn't know they were coming in with a grumpy choir director. And at presentation, those were the bell pole carriers who knocked over the wedding photography and did all those things. Every single one of those things happened to me. Just not in one parish on one Sunday. But you see a well-connected pastor and pastoral council with staff serving as resource to that principally constructed, consultative body would have eliminated all of this. Except for the bishop arriving. They tend to do that. Archbishop Hepta just appears in a Sunday sacristy. And we've had 3 pastors go into comas because of that. The bishop with his microphone on was then Auxiliary Bishop Robert Carlson, now the Archbishop of St. Louis. And he didn't care, his mic was on. And that was Thanksgiving morning, my first Thanksgiving as a newly ordained priest, when he turned to me and said, "You got my message, you're preaching this hymn." And I hadn't got the message. And yes, I once had to put on a white stole for another Pentecost Sunday. The Archbishop Flynn was the celebrant and fortunately harmless. But there wasn't another red stole. That was a presentation of Blessed Virgin Mary. The people were embarrassed for me. It was obviously a 70s piece, love. Embroidered leaves all over the place. Do we have somebody? Great.
One might say that the issue was communication, or left hand not knowing what the right hand. Tips on communication within, between the body and the head and through the neck. Yes, besides bulletins.
Sure. There's a word that can't be overused. To build a relationship of trust. And that takes time. It's also realizing that, the church doesn't turn like a speedboat. And so anytime we're trying to do things quickly, there's bound to be all kinds of miscommunications. Give things some time. We shouldn't act as if the end of time is this year and we have to do everything. Sometimes it's good to put it a year out so we can do some planning around those things. Staff, I think, are good at understanding when they need to let the pastor know about things so the pastor can mention it at a parish council meeting. But when you have that consultative body and the pastor, in unity with the bishop and the pastoral council of the diocese, and communications flow, typically miscommunications are kept to a minimum. But it has to be intentional. I think too often we think that because a meeting is on the calendar, everything that is taken care of. No, at that meeting we have to ask the questions. Father, the staff is talking to us about a big event called Pentecost Sunday. Do you know anything about that? But instead, those members of the new council had just gone ahead in their old roles and planned it all. So it's good to ask questions. It's good to let time improve communications, make for good planning. Watch out for just the major big events that suddenly drop out of the sky. And when those happen, they do. look more specifically at making sure the pastor and the pastoral council are on the same page. Staff helps with that. Pastoral council members, it's always good. Yes, you have a leadership role as lay leaders in the parish and lay leadership for the diocese. But it doesn't give you unilateral authority to just go and do things. You should always have some sense that people know what you're doing. So that would be just off the cuff, some things. Be intentional. Be intentional. Make those meetings meaningful for communications. They used to say location, but now with cyber world technology, where this is connecting us everywhere, it really is communications.
Father, can you talk a little bit about, this example highlights, sometimes we love or we latch onto as a community these events, and about, as opposed to kind of our strategic vision, our parish outlook, our parish, developing a parish culture, kind of developing our life in Christ in that way, and then we latch onto this particular event of Pentecost Sunday, or parish festival, or whatever it might be in our particular community. It's kind of, takes a lot of our energy and time and talent. Not that they're bad, but sometimes they take up perhaps a disproportionate amount of our attention.
Exactly. I think it's looking at what we have the labor to do. We love the big events. I don't know about in South Dakota and Minnesota. You can have a big event, you'll get a turnout. Serve good food, oh, the place is packed. So we like the big events, the big food things, festivals, and big school events. Really, our first energy is in Sunday, every Sunday. When we do Sundays well, the other 6 days fall into place. We can take our cue, especially here in this diocese, take the cue from last night's Christmas Mass. Oh my goodness, every detail was taken care of. I knew where to turn and where to move. It was all well communicated. Everybody took care of everything. If you want to look at a wonderfully organized major event in the life of the church, last night's Christmas Mass and your beautiful homily, Bishop, it was just a beautiful Mass. It was wonderful. There was no shade to Pentecost Sunday. I mean, the story in that Mass. I know that for about I used to tell the pastoral council, it takes 50 ideas to come up with one good one. And it made it convenient for me to say, okay, that's 38, we have 12 more to go. And a lot of them were big events. And when we are already putting on some major events, many parishes are getting ready for Triduum. For Holy Thursday, Good Friday, the Easter Vigil, Easter Sunday. In a lot of parishes, that's a huge effort of participation in the apostolate to make sure that it all goes well and goes smoothly. And so some parishes who then put their spring festival the week after Easter and expect all those people from Triduum to now do all the parish festivals. Sometimes we don't have to ask too many questions why people don't always show up or always say yes. Look at the timing, look at just like a company would in terms of our labor force. Yes, we're in the vineyard of the Lord doing all this work, but it's nice to pace it out to the calendar, be intentional. Sometimes strategic planning is just looking at the balance of the year to come. That's a nice way for a pastoral council to say, this all works.
Good, thank you. Lori.
I wanted to ask if you had any inroads to the territorial problems. The kitchen didn't want to leave, the choir wasn't open to any additional
You go to another. I have never had, and it's funny, you can go across this country and you ask pastors, do you have keys to the funeral luncheon supplies? We also know. That was a flippant answer. The shortest answer is you just call it out. Sometimes you can have some very interesting conversation with the funeral luncheon workers. I used to treat them to a dinner. I would have other people, sometimes staff, make them a dinner for all the year that they were serving all these luncheons to the grieving. And at that dinner, sometimes I would just say, because they would say to me, all these funerals, and we're getting stretched, and then we have to do the festival. And I said, well, use the young people. So sometimes you just have to keep bringing it up in a non-threatening way. I would tell Betty I was taking away her funeral luncheon keys, as she did let teenagers, decorate tables. But it's also working with staff. I worked a lot with youth ministry to do things in the elder care facilities. Because many of those facilities were served by extraordinary ministers of the Eucharist who just happened to be on Betty's committee for funeral luncheons, and they saw the youth come and they were all teared up, and it broke down some of the division. With choirs, I think pastors and lay leaders have tried all sorts of things. There seems to be something in music that really kind of marks some boundaries. I don't know a single classical organist who would ever allow a guitar. And when you have contemporary music, young people playing instruments and all of that stuff, you have to really talk to them to get them to put the synthesizer on organ so that they can do a little bit of traditional music. Start small, ask for one thing. I was very pleased one evening, 1,000 people in church, 6 p.m. Sunday evening, a pastor's nightmare. But, sometimes that's what's convenient for the folk. And the opening hymn, the musician on the synthesizer with a group of high school kids with instruments, they did an old traditional Marian hymn with the organ and with soft horns, not the blaring of the trumpets. It was beautiful. You should have seen that keyboardist when, I'm not a big fan for applause in church, and we're not at a concert after all. But the people all burst into applause at the end of the opening hymn. And that guy looked at me like, well, you might be right. Little pieces, non-threatening, planting seeds, knowing that will grow. Pastors need patience. We're not going to transform the church in one parish in one assignment. People need to be patient. Things happen over time. Take the things we already do and do them well, and focus on Sundays so that all the people who are coming to church on Sunday really feel inspired in music and in preaching, in the prayer to people. Gosh, I sat near the back of the church for morning prayer because it's a luxury for a priest, and to sit where, at least in Minnesota, all the people sit. And to hear the volume of your praying. There's a sound. Could you hear it? There's a sound when every voice is given to prayer. And so when in parishes, when we're the leadership of the parishes, both lay and clergy, including our deacons, when we give voice to song and prayer, we never know, that person whose lips aren't moving is probably hearing a people who know how to pray. Don't underestimate the sound of your prayers on Sundays. Most of us love it when we raise the rafters. It even has that phrase, raise the rafters, when we sing. And we have to work with very creative music directors not to do new music every Sunday, because after a while we get passive then. We become spectators. There should be at least always one hymn where we get to raise the rafters so that all the visitors and the seekers can hear us singing in one voice, one hymn.
You could have already answered my question.
I always think if I say enough words somewhere in there, there'll be something. If I inspire you, thank God. If I confuse you, blame me.
I've been on staff with the Keynote for quite a while.
God bless you. Good work.
Most of your story has happened. My question is, when it takes place, I mean, God comes to the Mass, you got a Mass. Everything else is just flourish. But when all that stuff takes place, when things aren't quite as we wish, how do you recenter yourself? How do you forget about the pastor not having the keys to the closet, or the people who don't show up, or all the other sundry things that happen to make the Mass happen? How do you recenter yourself and those that minister with you to get to the place where you can be a part of the Mass
Sure.
and not continually think about the way that it is from training?
Yeah, the most serious and important answer is prayer. I found it really helps me to just basically take whatever happens to pray well, particularly before big events. The second thing is humor. God gave us this gift so that we could laugh at ourselves. Not because we're funny, but because we're not. And to hear you all laughing at some of my greatest traumas in 20 years of priesthood is proof. You know, I think I say in our closing conference, a joyful spirit is proof of the existence of God. But you let it go. In the case of one of the parishes where we had the great chaos with the mayor's wedding, people came to me and they said, that was a mess. What are we going to do? Well, funny you should ask. We had this commission for liturgy and worship. They will be looking at this, making recommendations to our pastoral council. More often than not, this is a good thing for pastors to know. We're not carrying it alone. Good people, good lay leaders in the pew are also seeing how these things go. But how do we let it go when it's happening? Practice, practice. There are so many times we just let it go, let it happen. Who can control when an altar server throws up during the pastor's homily? I didn't even want to joke because I knew it would embarrass that poor young man. But, I tried not to take it as a sign that somebody threw up during my preaching. But notice in every of these cases how we found humor after the fact. I've learned as things are happening, and I'm going, oh, for crying out loud. And sometimes I just say Hail Mary. And then chuckle, knowing that, well, I can always expand the story of Pentecost Sunday. So, God always gives us the grace to turn things upside down. So if it's traumatic or poorly planned or unorganized or people are upset, be patient, pray about it, wait a little bit, and laugh at it.
Thanksgiving dinners don't always go well. You laugh. Or cry.
Or cry. Cry first, then laugh.
All right, thank you once again, Father. Appreciate that.